What would happen if you replaced most of the land with water instead of a regular vintage story world? Well, apparently something very similar to the very bad Kevin Costner movie that shall not be named. Waterworld. I performed the poll and it's clear, y'all want to see this. So I booted up Vintage Story and cooked up a seed where 90% of the world was sparkling with water as far as the eye could see. After conquering the desert, it was time to step into something much wetter. Growing up, I was a big fan of Robinson Crusoe. Something about being stuck on a tropical island has always appealed to me. It was time to put that desire to be stranded alone to the test, but inside the relative safety of a sandbox video game. Could I find enough food? Would I be able to acquire fresh water necessary for farming? Could I progress without easily accessible surface deposits? Could I do all of that in hardcore? I had so many questions and not many answers. If you want to find out what challenges the water world can throw at this gamer, come and swim deep with me into the Island Challenge. The island world dumped me into the middle of the ocean. Fortunately, the nearest land was not that far away. I decided to swim to the nearest landmass, which happened to be a small island. First order of business was to collect loose rocks. Many of these rocks were self-periodite, but there was some flint here as well. Once I was done playing an amateur archaeologist, I beat a couple of nearby trees into submission to get sticks. Shortly, I fell into a hole, which forced me to nab my first flint shovel in order to get out. When I finally got out, I proceeded to nab a flint knife, which I immediately put to use to harvest local berry bushes. I picked the delicious berries first though. I left the flowering bushes intact just in case. Next, I decided to explore my new home for points of interest. Despite the smaller size of the island, there was a survival goods merchant and a creepy ruin to boot. The ruin had a clay container just sitting there for the taking. This was a nice development, considering storage was going to be an issue for a long while, and the merchant had no storage containers in his cart, which I could have used in the interim. I continued exploring the island while harvesting the berries and the bushes. I have also spotted a bunch of vines on the oak trees. Vines, of course, could be made into rope, which would enable me to make a raft. And a raft was essential in this island world. As dusk was settling in, I encountered a boar who gave me a proper welcome. He did not appreciate having me as a neighbor, that's for sure.
Little people. Why can't we all just get along?
Besides berries, there were plenty of wild vegetables and grains to start a farming operation. Unfortunately, I lacked an important component of farming: fresh water. The salt water surrounding me was not suitable for irrigation. Meanwhile, the first night was knocking on the front door, so I quickly nabbed an axe and chopped down the nearest pine. In a typical fashion, I used dry grass and a few pine logs to create a fire pit, which I lit up using a fire starter. The cozy fire made the local environment appear a little more friendly, but I had another problem to solve. My tummy was growling. Thus, I tapped into my limited supply of berries to fuel the satiety meter. These berries would not last very long, but that was a problem for another day. Next, I decided to make a little door shack for myself, although I didn't even bother to put a door in it. Now that I had a torch, I wanted to continue exploring through the night, but the local drifters had other ideas. So, I had to retreat to safety of my campfire. The campfire did not prove to be much safer though. The familiar boar came back with vengeance and almost sent me to the grave. In full panic mode, I jumped into the ocean to escape the aggression and accidentally doused my torch. Fully submerged in the darkness, I deliberated my next move. I did not want to wait until the morning just swimming around. I came ashore and sheepishly lit my torch with a fire starter. Once I could see through the darkness, I ran to the merchant's cart to lick my wounds and to sleep off the darkness. In the morning, I made a mistake by picking a fight with a drifter. Not sure what my plan was. After getting almost clapped again, I climbed the walls of my dirt hut to rethink my life. Here, I got another round of bad news. A whole pack of wolves decided to spawn on my island to shit on my parade. It was time to put up or shut up.
I didn't hear no bell.
I nabbed 6 flint spears and got to work. Soon, 2 wolves and a pup were dead, netting me 10 bushmeat, which I tossed on a fire. It was no time to relax though. 2 more wolves were hiding in the bushes, resulting in another close call. I kept strategically using my dirt hut as a deadly trap, so perhaps not having a door ended up to my advantage. Now that I knew there was another angry boy hiding in the yellow flowers, I nuked him down from range. But that was not all. By the merchant's card, I found yet another wolf, making the total 5 adult wolves and 4 pups. At the very least, the bushmeat would provide me with food for a little while. After committing a wolf genocide, I dug out a 2-block deep safety pit. This was another pseudo-trap for all the aggressive fauna that was coming after me. Next, I chopped down a nearby oak tree, crafted a raft with a rope, courtesy of all the vines I managed to collect. As I was trying to craft an oar, a familiar boar came to pick a fight with me in the darkness. I decided it was safer to sleep off the rest of the night. In the morning, my safety pit proved itself useful without any active participation. A sow and 3 piglets were stuck in it. Now that the boar fucked off to somewhere else, I could finally finish crafting an oar. It was time to explore another island. The raft wasn't particularly fast, but sure beat swimming by a landslide. I set my sights on a pretty big landmass directly southeast of me. There were a lot of berries here, ripe for the taking. Another important find happened to be a large clay deposit. Once I loaded up on clay, I decided to head back to start a few clay projects. Mainly, I focused on sculpting molds required for the next progression phase. I made a hammer mold, a pickaxe mold, a prospecting pick mold, an anvil mold, a cooking pot, and a few bowls. While trying to start a clay firing process, my nemesis showed up to square off with me one more time. This time around, I successfully lured him into the safety pit. Now that the boar was out of my way for good, I got working on harvesting dry grass with a flint knife. However, the game did not allow me to relax for much longer. Another batch of wolves spawned right on top of my humble dwelling. It was a very close encounter that almost cost me my entire progression. On the bright side, I had another batch of bushmeat ready to cook. I now had a couple of wolf pups stuck in the pit as well. I wish you could domesticate them, that would be really cool. As if nothing happened, I proceeded to whack local trees for sticks. Meanwhile, I had yet another wolf show up in the pit, this time an adult. So I took care of him and got rid of the wolf pups as well. I was afraid they could hurt my piggies, which I had other plans for. I could finally load the pits with grass, sticks, and firewood. I ignited the pits while also setting off a wildfire in my area. After I put out the brush fire, I set off to visit the big island, mainly to load up on sand. Penning was on the menu. I have yet to find any signs of surface copper deposits, and penning was guaranteed to be faster than island hopping to collect copper bits. Once I had enough sand, I rolled back home and set up a panning operation by the shore. I didn't get to pan for very long before drifters began interrupting the process. So I slept at the merchant's place once again. However, before I could resume panning, I needed food to last me through the entire activity. The berries were long gone, and the bushmeat from the wolves was also depleting. I saw a lot of large wildlife roaming the big island on the previous visits, so that is where I went despite the rain. I spotted a few bighorns and used a dirt tower trick to safely wear down the male before finishing him off with a single throw. The female suffered the same fate. Against my better judgment, I rushed and tried to tackle the last female without a dirt tower. This almost cost me dearly as she chased me angrily around the island. Luckily, she gave up on the chase and I finished her off without further incident. I crossed back home and started cooking a full 6x6x6x6 pot of meat stew. This would last me for a very long time. Meanwhile, I remembered a few clay things that still needed to be made. I formed a crucible and 4 ingot molds, which I put into 3 pits, filled them with dry grass, a bunch of sticks, firewood, and lit them up to cook. Finally, I could resume panning for 60 copper bits. Let's face it, the panning process is not terribly exciting, which is why I finally graduated to AutoPan mod. It helped with the tedium quite a bit. About halfway through the process, I decided to take a break to make a small charcoal pit. After all, I was getting close to smelting my first batch of copper, and the charcoal would be the next bottleneck. Thus, I chopped down the last few trees on my island to put into the pit. The oaks proved to be an incredible source of wood. Even just one single big oak provided a staggering amount of wood, which made me expand my charcoal ambitions by a lot. I had no extra storage to keep this wood otherwise. Soon, the firewood logs were stacked up, so I covered the pit with dirt blocks and ignited the pile. Besides charcoal, there was another thing missing from the smelting process. In the haste to get everything else going, I forgot about tongs. Unfortunately, I used up all the rope for the raft and couldn't find any more vines on my island. This necessitated a bit of island hopping until I found a few more vines on one of the smaller islands in the vicinity. When it was time to return home, it became obvious that I forgot to bring a torch.
I keep having this nagging feeling that I've forgotten something.
Hey, if you forgot it, it probably wasn't all that important.
Yeah, I guess.
So gradually I got plunged into the darkness as I rode back home. Somehow I navigated back to my makeshift base successfully. Finally, I could return to the exciting task of panning for copper. I was still far away from the required 60 bits, but through the power of editing, I was done in a jiffy. I swung by the now finished charcoal pit and dug out a stack of charcoal. I left the rest in the pit. Storage was still a massive issue. Now that I had all the components for copper, I loaded up the crucible with 60 bits, stuffed it with charcoal, and lit the fire pit. I waited impatiently for the copper to liquefy enough to be able to pour into the clay molds. I smelted a hammer, a pickaxe, and a prospecting pick. I could finally mine for copper, but I had no leads on copper surface deposits, which meant I would need to find an underground copper deposit through blind exploration. But first, I needed to craft an oil lamp. Unfortunately, I ate all the fat for sustenance. Luckily, I spotted a boar swimming near my island and harvested him for a single piece, which enabled me to craft an oil lamp after all. I grabbed my mining gear and ran to the edge of the water, ignoring the drifters. They weren't going to be a problem where I was going. I dove down and prospected a chunk near the island. The results were not promising though. I only had a single copper pickaxe and a single prospecting pick, which meant I would need to find copper sooner rather than later. I would be back to panning otherwise. The next chunk looked even worse. The third one didn't look any better, and the trend continued. After prospecting a circle around the island and testing the island as well, it was clear I needed to look elsewhere. So I mounted my raft and set in the direction of the big island. On the way there, I finally reached level 2 in the survival skills of the X skills mod. In general, it took a very long time to level. There were very few interesting talents. For example, I picked a bit of extra health for this one, so I will only highlight the ones that stood out from now on. I started prospecting around the island, but did not see anything promising here either. My prospecting pick was taking a beating, but I did not have any leads on copper, even after prospecting most of the big island. I hopped on my raft once again and proceeded to another small island east of the big one. While prospecting underwater, I hit the biggest reading of copper yet. It was far from great, but despite that, I decided to shoot my shot. I dove down and started digging directly down while prospecting intermittently. In the end, I only had additional wear and tear on my tools to show for it. I decided to try another spot even more east. The copper reading here was significantly higher, but still not in the guaranteed category. My prospecting pick picked up cassiterite, which was nice, but tin was useless without copper. I kept on digging, getting closer and closer to the mantle. Around Y21, my prospecting pick picked up a trace amounts of copper. The readings were gradually getting stronger as I was descending even further. It was all but a guarantee now, and before long I stood before a very large copper vein, just in time. My tools were about to give up on me. I spent just enough time down here for my copper pickaxe to break, after which I emerged back to the surface. I rode back to my island under the light of a single oil lamp. Once I hit the shore, I noticed that riff activity was still off the charts, so I ran into the safety of the merchant's cart and slept through the darkness. In the morning, I broke the copper ore with a hammer and loaded up the crucible with 1500 units of copper ore. This was enough for a copper anvil, 4 copper ingots, and another copper pickaxe. I was officially past the Stone Age. I didn't feel like doing much else, so I waited for things to cool off. When the copper was officially cool enough to be taken out of the molds, I ran into the creepy ruin for a few cobblestone to craft a forge. Once I had a forge, I slapped 4 ingots down, slotted in a piece of charcoal, and started a heating process. My very first tool was a saw. It was time to put an end to my storage woes. To that effect, I smithed 8 copper nails and finished off the session with the copper shears. I made a bunch of planks with the saw, combined them with the nails, and crafted 8 small chests. I then converted them into 4 double chests and slapped them on the ground. Suddenly, my storage capacity felt infinite, like the universe itself. Mind you, I still had 0 personal bags to my name. Once I organized my inventory, I smelted another 4 copper bars. I did not want to wait for them to cool off. Instead, I rafted back to the chunk where I found the copper. I had two tasks in mind. First, mine more copper since I was already completely out. Second, find the tin, which my prospecting picked up earlier. I figured, might as well get tin bronze going for an iron transition down the line. I did a little bit of digging and found the deposit that was setting off my prospecting pick. This felt like the easiest tin of my life. There was a very respectable amount of tin down here. Once I found all the tin I could, I resumed mining for copper and spent the rest of the pick's durability to load up. Soon, my temporal stability was nearing zero, so I counted my blessings and went back up with my spoils. On the surface, I briefly encountered Dave. He gave me his blessing and told me he was proud of my progress. When I made it back to my island, I smelted a tin bronze pickaxe and killed a lone wolf patrolling nearby. Except it wasn't the only one. In life, there are only two guarantees: death and wolves, and sometimes death by wolves. Next, I engaged in another smithing session. I made a copper axe and a copper shovel. Unfortunately, it was time to drop everything I was doing and take care of the food, more precisely, lack of it. I rode back to the big island and found a few more bighorns. I had a pretty close call when I decided to abuse the Malefactor's range, but instead the bighorn abused my health pool. I did not repeat the same mistake twice though. Once I had enough meat for a full pot of stew, I decided to cook it on the big island. With a big pot of stew in my hands, I tried to find the raft, but seemed to have misplaced it somewhere. Kids, always pick up your raft, even if you are confident you know where it is. To make matters worse, I accidentally doused my torch and was plunged into the darkness yet again. Unable to do anything about it, I had to wait until dawn. At dawn, I finally found the raft, but decided to explore the big island a little more. After all, I had a whole day of sunlight ahead of me. I found quite a bit of wild flax sitting around, so I helped myself to all of it, hoping to have a massive flax farm one of these days. The exploration wasn't without its dangers. I spotted my first bear roaming the island, luckily before it could spot me, all while a bunch of wolves were growling at me from nearby bushes. By the time I started my journey home, I had 36 seeds to my name. The side effect of that, I had just enough flax fibers to make my first linen bag, expanding my inventory by 50%. At home, I found myself in a familiar situation of getting chased off into the ocean by an angry boar. And of course, I doused my torch in the water yet again. I just about had enough of this island. I desperately wanted off it at some point. Everything from this point would be in an effort to make that difficult transition happen. I got tired of doused torches leaving me in complete darkness. A lantern was an obvious next step. So I grabbed a shovel and went back to the creepy ruins. I had spotted bony soil in there and now had a reason to dig it out. I went back to the shore and panned through the limited amount of bony soil. The temporal gods had smiled upon me and granted me 3 candles. I also got a few flax fibers, which I spent to craft a bucket. Next, I started digging out large amounts of soil to use as a temporary building foundation for my future house. The low fertility soil would be converted into packed dirt, and the medium fertility soil would be reserved for farming. My task was interrupted by a temporal storm. Luckily, I enabled a setting that allowed me to sleep through the storms, which is exactly what I did. Once the storm had passed, I rode back to the big island to find some quartz. There was plenty of it scattered around the surface. I was also here to fill up a bucket with fresh water. There were a few freshwater sources on the big island as well. When I had enough clear quartz and a bucket full of water, I rode back and smelted 4 copper ingots. I waited for them to cool off and then heated them up to smith a copper plate. With the plate, clear quartz, and a candle, I crafted my first lantern. Torches were a thing of the past. I also smithed a hoe for future farming. Next, I smithed more nails, and with those nails, I crafted a couple of small chests. I would use these chests to help me transport my stuff to the new housing location, courtesy of the Carry On mod. Next, I wanted to relocate my piggies. Animal cage mod to the rescue. I crafted 5 animal cages to transport my pigs. The mod required the pigs to be badly hurt before they could be trapped, so that is exactly what I did. As a benefit, it would put the pigs into flight mode and allow me to jump into the pit to trap them. This was probably a bit too bold since the pigs would still occasionally attack me. Nonetheless, I filled up the cages and escaped the pit. Next, I crafted a stack of fencing. I needed the pigs to have their own fence corral on the other end. Most preparations for the big journey were now done, except for my empty pot. So another trek to the big island was in order. I used the familiar strategy to hunt bighorns yet again. Once I had 24 pieces of red meat, I switched my focus to another problem. I had no way of feeding the pigs to start the breeding process at my new base. My only real choice was to go after fruit mash. I spent a long time circling the island trying to collect all the berries not nailed to the wall. Soon, the island felt void of any more berries with every bush empty. At home, I crafted another bucket and smithed a copper chisel. I had all other necessary materials and thus the fruit press was born. I loaded up the press and started smashing the berries. The amount of mash produced from the berries was a tad disappointing. This was not a sustainable way to feed my piggies long term, but would be enough for the initial phase. Once I was done mashing, I crafted a couple of large troughs in the preparation. It was hard to believe, but I was ready to relocate. Thus, I loaded up a single small chest with the most important resources and slapped it on my back. I filled up the rest of my inventory to the brim and took off on a long journey. I sailed through the night and I sailed through the day. About 3,000 blocks from my original island, I saw a shallow sandbar with a bunch of bold cypresses sticking out of it. This was far enough south and looked like a cool place to settle. This location offered both a shallow underwater foundation to build on top of and scenic bold cypresses to keep me company. Logistically, one of the bigger islands was the smartest place to settle, but what I had in mind was way cooler and thematic. All that was left to do was to make a pillar extending from the water. This would be the farming section of my future compound. First order of business was to set up a flax grow. I lined up the medium fertility soil in rows with trenches for water between them. For now, everything was going to focus on function rather than form. I used my freshwater bucket to make irrigation canals and hoe the land in preparation for the seeding. Next, I planted my first batch of flax, 45 seeds in total. Following, I extended the platform to create a little space for the chests and other miscellaneous operations. One of these operations would be a fenced area for the piggies. I placed the large troughs in the corral, loaded them up with fruit mash, and let out the pigs. They immediately started enjoying the fruit mash. I left the piggies to rest. I, on the other hand, had no time to rest. I still had a lot of extra gear to haul to the new location. While rowing back to my starter island, I noticed that I leveled my survival skill to level 3. This time around, there was an interesting talent called Nudist. The less clothes you wore, the better the bonuses. So I threw out all of my threads, except of course, there was no way to be actually nude in Vintage Story. I guess I was really a never nude nudist.
Oh, stop booing! There's nothing wrong with it! There are dozens of us! Dozens!
When I reached the small island, the first order of business was to capture the rest of the boars. So I heard them once more and jumped into the pit to capture them. Once again, they put up a big fight. Next, I grabbed the rest of the charcoal I left in the pit, took most noteworthy things out of the chests, threw away the rest, and set off on another long journey to the south. Once arrived, I unloaded my haul into the storage and released the pigs. I had 7 females and 1 male, which was a respectable place to start from. Not wanting to waste any more time, I decided to explore a massive island chain east of my new home. My primary goal was to harvest any berries I could find to juice for more fruit mash. I needed females pregnant ASAP, and the fruit mash I brought with me was not nearly enough. While exploring the island, I stumbled upon an important find: cattails. Cattails were enabling in many ways, and I would come back to harvest them later. Meanwhile, I traveled to another island and spotted a couple of more pigs. Since I had the cages with me, I took this opportunity to capture them as well. This was quite a beautiful, lush, and flat island, ideal for berry hunting. Once I had enough berries, I rode back home. Then I released the new piggies. This would be the last batch I brought to the enclosure. I busted out the fruit press and started juicing. The resulting fruit mash went into the large troughs. I had 13 pigs now, and some females were pregnant already. The pigs did not require my input any longer, it was just a waiting game now. I moved on. I smithed a copper shovel and rowed to the nearest small island full of large oaks. My primary motivation was to get more dirt for building. I wanted to expand the pig enclosure as a first order of business. It needed a bit more size for the first official pig explosion. Of course, my copper tools were not lasting me very long, so I had to be constantly smelting additional copper bars and smithing replacement tools. It was time to start thinking about getting my hands on iron. First things first, I had to get fire clay bricks for the bloomeries. This meant getting dry grass and sticks for firing the bricks. I had to smith the shears and the scythes first. Since I was already metalworking, I poured a tin bronze anvil needed for the iron smithing. I would also need another prospecting pick to search for iron, and a copper one would do. Then I smithed a copper chisel and chiseled the old copper anvil into copper bars. I used these bars to smith a copper shovel and a knife. With these goodies, I returned to the oak island. Here, I was finding a ton of mushrooms growing on the oaks, helping me to sustain myself without needing to hunt. I started working on collecting sticks with the shears when I heard a familiar buzzing sound. And sure enough, there was a beehive in the baby oak. A wonderful find indeed. I resumed collecting sticks before stopping to make a full pot of mushroom stew. At base, I set up an area for the upcoming clay firings. Of course, I still needed the actual clay to make bricks. This meant a trip to the eastern island chain. First, I stopped by the cattails I found earlier to get the tops, but also to dig up all the roots. I was going to replant them at my place for long-term use. I immediately flipped the cattails into 2 reed bags. Inventory space was king. The next stop was by a relatively small fire clay deposit. Then I rode across the northern island to the green flat meadows. The meadows were ideal for harvesting grass extra fast. I would come back here often for this exact task. There was also a good amount of flax all around the island and it was easy to spot. Of course, I always needed more dirt for building additional sections of my compound. I was abusing the chest carrying functionality of the Carry On mod as extra inventory space for all of this loot. It was quite convenient to have extra storage since my inventory was still rather limited. When I made it back, I set up a batch of bricks to cook. I had a lot of grass, sticks, and wood at my disposal at this point. While the bricks were cooking, I started to expand my flax operation. After all, I had at least 50 flax seeds itching to be planted. I added the water to make the plots irrigated, hoed the land, and finally planted every single flax seed. This was officially a massive flax operation with over 90 seeds. Next, I began the construction of the cattail pond. I extended my base, added water into the basin, and planted the cattail roots. Things were looking good, my progress felt measurable, and the location was inspiring me to start building cool shit. I had to solve my hunger first though. Once again, I chose to visit the island chain to the east. Unfortunately, it was much harder to find food here. I managed to spot a few gazelles and even took a shot at a couple of rabbits, and yet I still couldn't get a full pot of stew going, so I settled for a partial one instead. Meanwhile, I started prospecting around to see if I could spot iron. My first prospecting attempt showed a very small presence of iron in this chunk. I took another stab a little further north, but the iron content was still only around 1%. Feeling a bit impatient, I took a gamble and started digging down. I went all the way down to Y29. Normally, iron tends to spawn lower in the strata. I started digging sideways and prospected every 4 blocks. Things were not going well, and I was finding nothing. Realizing that perhaps I was a little too ambitious, I decided to move on and to try my luck elsewhere. On the way up, I decided to prospect every 10 blocks just in case. To my utter surprise, right around Y80, I got a hit. I dug sideways a bit and the view opened up to a big cave with walls adorned by iron ore. And of course, where there's iron, there's a lot of it. Just like that, an iron transition was on the horizon. On the way out, I spotted a rune inside of the cave. Inside of the rune, I picked up a cool looking tapestry and a golden shield. A little bit of extra bonus to sweeten the pot. Just like that, I was on the way home with everything I needed to start the Iron Age. At home, I grabbed the now done fire clay bricks, crafted bloomeries with the said bricks, placed them down, loaded them with iron bits and charcoal, and lit them up. I could practically smell the iron blooms cooking, and the smell was good. Feeling impatient, I crafted a hay bed and slept through the cooking process. Next, I grabbed the blooms out of the bloomeries and started smithing a bunch of iron tools. I started by smithing a hammer and 2 axes. I then smithed a sword head and flipped it into a blackguard sword. With the 2 shiny axes, I sailed to the oak island and cut down one of the oaks. These oaks were magical. A single oak consumed an entire axe and instantly filled up my inventory, plus a small chest with oak logs. I had to even leave a bunch of logs behind. It also leveled me in the forestry skill. I picked an interesting talent that gave me a chance to collect resin every time I cut down a pine or acacia. It was going to make things a lot easier in the future. I made a trip home to deposit the wood and immediately returned to repeat the process. Once I made it back for good, I smithed another axe to replace the ones spent cutting oaks. I also smithed a shovel and a knife, and now I had a full iron kit to my name. I didn't waste much time and set off to the island chain. There was a lot more things to do there. My first cool find was papyrus. This was a southern equivalent of cattails, but one that didn't require water. Of course, I helped myself to both the tops and the bottoms. I was going to replant these at my base as well. I also found more cattails and helped myself to those as well. Meanwhile, I started loading up on flowers because I had all other components to start a bee farm. Another exciting development, cattails and papyrus, allowed me to craft rash matting, a necessary component for my first sailboat, courtesy of the Joy of Sailing mod. Besides matting, I needed a ton of rope, but this was not a problem. I found plenty of trees completely covered in vines. Once I had the rope, I crafted a new raft and then flipped it into a sail-powered one. This sail raft was a nice luxury in my world and a lot of fun to boot. The speed varied dramatically depending on the wind conditions and the wind direction though. Sometimes it was more efficient to row still. On the way back, I got caught by a temporal storm while sailing, but that wasn't a big deal on the water. Instead, I got a friendly visit from Dave. We were having a nice conversation about our favorite local restaurants when Dave vanished. I was sad to see him go.
Wilson, where are you? Wilson! Wilson!
At home, I planted additional cattails and expanded the farm to include a papyrus field. Meanwhile, I was starting to think about a house. First, I smithed a wrench to work with wood. I had an idea for a deck made from planks, and a wrench was essential. I then smithed a saw for all the boards I was about to cut. I had plenty of oak logs to work with, thus I made a gazillion plank blocks. With the planks, I started to construct a wooden deck. It was just going to be a big rectangle, nothing fancy. Then of course, came a big task of filling in the rectangular shape with wood. Once I filled the shape, I flipped all the planks into their correct orientation. The deck was done. Next, I transitioned into a long smithing session. First, I smithed 2 axes in preparation for more tree cutting. Then, I smithed a pantograph from the chisel mod, shoutout QP Tech. Finally, I smithed the iron wedge, also courtesy of the chisel mod. At the end of the session, I harvested my first batch of cattails and crafted my very first bee skep. Next, I sailed to the oak island and found the beehive. I placed the skep on the ground and flowered the living hell out of the surrounding area. I then chopped down a couple oaks to fill my small chest and my inventory with wood. By the time I was finished, the skep was already populated. Guess I brought enough flowers. So I grabbed the skep, reversed the flower process, and set off home. At home, I expanded my farm area once more with a bit of dirt. I planted the flowers and placed the new skep in the middle. Unfortunately, I only had enough materials to craft a single skep at the moment. I moved on to building the support pillars for my wooden deck. I certainly wasn't going to let it just float in the air, that would look pretty dumb. I grabbed my supplies of oak logs and started placing the pillars underneath the deck. I settled for 3 rows of 5 pillars. Next, I wanted to add horizontal support beams to the pillars to make things look more rigid and thus believable. With the chisel mod, I only needed to chisel a single copy of the beam, rest could be pasted using the pantograph. The support beams got down pretty quickly, and I was pleased with the final result. Next, I mounted my sail raft and made a journey to the island chain to look for food. I was looking forward to the time when food was not an issue, but for now, I hunted bighorns yet again using a familiar strategy. Afterwards, I moved on to the southern part of the island and started cooking up a pot of stew on the beach. While the pot was cooking, I harvested a bunch of vines to be used for decorations underneath my wooden deck. There was definitely no shortage of vines. When I made it home, the first papyrus batch was ready to be harvested, which enabled me to craft another skep and place it in the bee area. Meanwhile, I started working on the staircase that would descend from my house to the wooden dock. So I worked on the staircase first, utilizing oak stairs to make a straight shot down to the water. At the water level, I built a wooden dock. Next, I started placing wooden beams underneath the staircase to make it look structurally sound. Pantograph was doing God's work for me, allowing me to quickly create these smaller details. One fact was clear to me now. I settled in a pretty rainy area. Thunderstorms were extremely common down here. So in order to protect my piggies, I smithed a lightning rod for the first time ever. I built an elevated pillar made of dirt inside of the corral and placed the rod on top. The lightning rod immediately proved to be useful as it absorbed a lightning strike right in front of my eyes. Next, I decided to chisel wooden rail guards for my dock. It made the dock look a bit more interesting, that's for sure. To add even further details, I started hanging vines to the underside of the decking to give it a bit of extra flair. When it got too dark to continue, I sailed to a new island directly to the south. It was chock full of bamboo trees. I had extensive plans to use this bamboo in my build. I grabbed some dirt while I was here as well. I seemed to be always running out of that stuff. Once I got back, I continued hanging the vines. Meanwhile, the beehives were starting to produce batches of honeycomb, so I clay formed and fired 4 balls in the pit in order to store all the honey while producing wax, in the effort to craft a bunch of lanterns to light up my place. Besides wax, I would need plates as well. Thus, I spent a good bit of time smelting the copper bars and hammering them into plates for my future lanterns. This activity was interrupted by need to look for sustenance. Off to the island chain I went. Once I downed enough bighorns, I stopped by quartz deposit to mine a bunch of it out. Quartz, of course, was the final component for the lanterns. I also mined out a few copper deposits found during exploration. Finally, I loaded up on even more flowers. The bee area was rapidly expanding, and that required a lot more of those. Once I had all the things, I sailed back home. My place was shrouded in darkness, but I was about to fix that. Meanwhile, I started planning out a skeleton of the house. This would be my primary residence once finished. I decided to use bamboo blocks to make the walls, something that felt tropical, but also a texture I have never used before. The house was going to be fairly modest. Once the foundation was laid out, I started adding maple fencing around the deck. The color was not doing it for me though, and I wanted to fix that. Meanwhile, the first batch of piglets was finally born. They were cute, but the sounds they made were a bit annoying, and the extra aggression from the pigs was not a welcome sight. My bee area had grown to 6 skeps, but I could barely keep up with the skep production and was constantly running out of cattails and papyrus. Another exciting development, my first batch of flax had grown to maturity, so I busted out a scythe and cut down the mature half of the field. This meant I could finally feed my pigs and get them breeding for the next generation. In other news, I had enough flax to craft a tailored gambeson set. This clashed a bit with the nudist talent and provided me with a bunch of penalties, but it was still worth wearing for the tier 2 protection and a peace of mind. I was allowed to unlearn the nudist talent, but it would need some form of alcohol first. I have never bothered to make alcohol before, but for now, X skills gave me the reason to do just that. Next, I destroyed the depleted farmland and put back the fresh medium fertility soil. Then of course I tilled it and planted back the flax. Besides making a full set of armor, I had enough flax to make a full set of linen bags. Finally, my inventory space didn't suck. The homestead chores were finished, and I set off on a big journey. The maple wood was a miss for me. Instead, I wanted to get my hands on some pine. This meant sailing all the way to the big island up north. As a bonus, I was also scoring occasional resin from the resin farmer talent. It was triggering a surprising amount despite a pretty low chance. While logging the pines, I had a massive scare. A brown bear came out of nowhere and was prepared to shred me into bits. Luckily, I was close enough to the deep water, and bears are shit swimmers. Once I had enough wood, I stopped by my old home to harvest the now ripe berry bushes. The fall colors were already permeating the environment. The winter was not far behind. Relocating to the south was looking like a great idea at this time. With an inventory full of wood and berries, I sailed back to my compound. The first order of business at home was to squeeze out the juice from the berries and seal it in the barrels to make wine. Next, I extended the base to make room for charcoal burn. I had plenty of oak logs to start a rather respectable charcoal pit. Once the charcoal was cooking, I replaced the ugly maple fencing with pine. I much preferred the pine's color to contrast the oak's decking. Once I finished placing the fence, I placed other pine features in the skeleton of my house, mainly doors and stairs. Meanwhile, it was time to start thinking about the windows to my new house. Glass panes were the answer, and I would need a lot of lead ingots to make that happen. Thus, I started clay forming ingot molds, going for 12 molds total. Once done, I stuffed them into the pits, loaded them up with grass and sticks, stacked firewood on top, and fired the pits. Another exciting development, I could finally afford to start slaughtering my own pigs for food. Not going to lie, chasing them around the pen was annoying as hell, but the payoff was my first farm-to-the-table meal. With all the projects keeping me busy, I had never stopped to smell the roses. I took a little break to enjoy a beautiful dawn, going from deep red to soft yellow and illuminating all my hard work. This place was starting to look awesome. After, I sailed to the Oak Island and approached the deep cave I spotted earlier. The local strata consisted of sandstone, thus I suspected this was a good place to find lead. I tried descending and suffered a fall that could have been much worse, but almost immediately I stumbled upon an outcropping of lead. This was a good sign. As I was navigating the cave, I had to fight a horde of drifters, but was rewarded with periodic deposits of lead. There was plenty of lead in this cave, and as a bonus, I found a borax deposit and mined it all out. Deep in the cave, I found something surprising. There was a big deposit of halite, also known as salt. This might be one of the rarest things to find in Vintage Story. I played hundreds of hours, and this was my first halite ever discovered in the wild. Unfortunately, there was no real reason for me to use salt. Despite that, I couldn't pass the opportunity to get some. There was also a ton of sylvite stuck in the walls of this massive deposit. It turns into potash fertilizer when ground. It would speed up my flax farm considerably. Furthermore, I found saltpeter in the cave as well. What a cave this was. With all the goodies, I sailed back home. At home, I dug out the freshly done charcoal pit. I then stuffed 3 bloomeries with quartz and charcoal to produce glass, which was another component for the glass panes. Meanwhile, I started pouring lead into the dozen molds in my possession. After, I sailed to the Oak Island and climbed a few oaks to shear the branches for sticks. I then sailed to the Meadow Island and went to town on the lush grass. At home, I used the sticks and grass to start the firing process on a batch of fire clay bricks and more clay bowls. The previous batch of bowls was now overflowing with honey. Meanwhile, the second batch of flax was ready to be harvested. Before replanting the flax, I wanted to grind the sylvite into potash to enrich the soil for flax. Once I crafted a quern, I ground the sylvite into potash, stripped the old farm soil, and replaced it with fresh medium fertility soil once more. Then I applied the potash to my field, and when I ran out, I substituted with saltpeter. My flax operation was entering Mach 10 speeds. Meanwhile, the bloomeries got done cooking. So I extracted the glass and started another 5 to make iron blooms. I had all the required components for the glass panes. So I combined glass, lead bars, and boards to make glass panes. I inserted them into the empty frames right after. Slowly but surely, the house was coming together. Next addition to the house would be the thatch roof. I thought the thatch roof looked cool with a bamboo foundation. However, I needed more bamboo blocks to extend the overhang of the roof. Before sailing off to the bamboo island, I crafted 2 sets of sails from the linen sheets, smithed a set of copper nails, made more rope from the vines, and combined with a few boards, made myself the ultimate sailboat. This puppy was significantly faster and got me to the bamboo island in no time at all. With bamboo blocks placed, I could continue placing the thatch roof. For the time being, I wasn't doing anything complex with the roof design. I ran out of thatch about halfway and had to get more. Meadow Island to the rescue. I spent an eternity on the island and got all the grass in the universe. This allowed me to craft more thatch roofing and finish the job. On top of the roof, I wanted to put a sunroof but ran out of glass to finish it. The house design was simple on purpose. To make the build pop visually, I had a lot of other embellishments in mind. I was just getting started. Simple or not, the house was ready for the move-in. So I relocated all the storage inside and moved all other infrastructure to the house as well. I finally had a roof over my head. Meanwhile, my first batch of wine was done brewing. An obvious progression of me getting shit-faced followed. Being drunk was a ton of fun. This allowed me to opt out of the nudist talent as it was silently hurting my stats. While I was busy getting drunk, my bees were working overtime, making me a steady supply of honey and wax on the regs. Wax I flipped into candles, and that meant it was time to mass produce lanterns. I was all out of copper though. I started randomly probing chunks around my base to see what the copper situation looked like. To my surprise, I quickly found a chunk with a very solid reading and shortly had all the copper in the universe. There was also a ton of brown coal down here, so I mined a couple of stacks of that as well. While swimming out, I noticed a ton of bioluminescence in the water, making my ascent pretty cinematic. At home, I got into a lengthy session of smelting copper bars and smithing those copper bars into plates. In the middle of the process, a batch of glass was finished. Thus, I could finally cap the sunroof with the glass blocks. Then I kept smithing, and smithing, and smithing. All of this smithing leveled me in the metalworking skill. Finally, I had a fun talent available to me. This talent gave me a chance to instantly finish a piece of work when moving any voxel. Despite only small chance per voxel, it was proccing quite often. After the session, I was able to craft 14 lanterns. I turned on the light overlay mod and started placing lanterns for the optimal coverage. Next, I stepped outside and started designing a lamppost by chiseling. Eventually, I settled on a design and started copying it around the deck in most efficient places. However, clearly, I needed a bit more coverage to produce a drifter-free zone. And so it went. I ran back and forth between the lampposts, slowly using the pantograph and the wedge to copy them in the designated places. After I finished placing the posts, I had a good amount of coverage, but not enough to eliminate all the red zones. I would need dozens more lanterns to fix this issue, but for now, wax was rate limiting my lantern progress. I had to give my bees more time to do their thing. My pig population was massive now. I could easily sustain a full meat diet. It was still rather annoying to kill them, but I was never going to hit the later generation to utilize the meat cleaver. Meanwhile, I started spicing up my build with cool details. I was disappointed to find out that bamboo, in its natural form, was not usable outside of the creative mode. My backup plan was to chisel a bamboo block to look like, well, bamboo, the reverse Uno card. In the end, I liked the solution quite a bit, just wish the color was a bit brighter and bamboo-like. The extra details were starting to stack up and added much more needed complexity to the build. Next, it was time to add luxury to my compound. First, I added a shaded area with a thatched roof. To support the roof, I used the same bamboo stakes I designed earlier. I did a bad job estimating my material needs, and in the end had to constantly travel to get more. The bamboo island was a common travel destination. Behind the first mini-roofed area, I was going to place an identical structure. Repetition and symmetry, the foundation of creativity. Meanwhile, the beast produced a lot more wax, and that meant additional lanterns were now available. That, of course, involved a lot of additional smithing. Needless to say, I was rather tired of smithing by hand. It was time to automate the smithing task via help hammers, and that meant building a windmill. I had a design in mind that would utilize polished rock. This meant smithing 12 iron splitter plugs, courtesy of the Stone Quarry mod. The smithing talent that gave me a chance to instantly finish the work was doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's my favorite X-skill talent by far. I also had to smith a few finishing chisels. Before diving into the stone quarrying, I wanted to build a few flower boxes around my compound. Flower boxes are simple, but add so much flair to any place. Once the flower boxes were placed, it was time to gather the stones. I dove into the water directly under my house. After all, I knew the two stone colors I wanted existed right under my compound. If you watched me before, you will recognize this process. I do this a lot, since polished blocks are my favorite blocks to build with. In general, I prefer the untextured blocks since they allow a little more freedom in the design. The stone quarrying is a simple process. Mark a 6x6x6 cube, drive them in with a hammer, and collect a big slab. Once I had enough sandstone slabs, I descended deeper into the crust until I encountered slate. Eventually, I emerged from the depth with enough sandstone and slate slabs for my creative needs. I lined up the slabs in my house and used a hammer and a finishing chisel to extract the polished rock. A very slow process. Better have a show ready on the second monitor. I chose Suits on Netflix.
Because it's everything. Everyone that I love. Trevor, my grandmother, Harvey, now probably this job. I am not ready to lose you.
Once I extracted all the polished rock, I stopped by the flax field as another batch came in. The application of nutrients was supercharging my flax rates, but even then, I couldn't keep up with feeding all of the pigs. Many females had no chance to eat the required portions to reproduce. Once I ran out of flax feed, I planted yet another round of flax, despite it being November. This far south, I could grow all year long. Next, I had a big project of building the windmill looming over me. I started by placing a large stem that would lift out from the water and into the sky. I connected the stem via a bridge to my wooden deck for ease of access. Once that was done, I began working on a flat platform higher up. This platform was the foundation of the automation room where everything would eventually reside. While building this platform, it finally happened. I got hit by my very first vintage story lightning strike. It did surprisingly little damage. I pretended like nothing happened and continued working on the windmill. Next part involved building a circular tunnel about 7 blocks higher than the main platform. Once I finished building it, I connected it to the platform with the same stem design, with a ladder going through the stem. I put a cross section on the inside of the tunnel and slapped a 4-sail windmill in the middle. The shaft behind it would run all the way down to the automation room. Once I had a single windmill built, I was going to stack 3 more right behind it. It made for a cool looking design in the end. Unfortunately, I had no linen sheets to supply the last windmill with sails, so I decided to wait for another batch of flags to come in. Meanwhile, I started building out the pools underneath the mini roofed areas, champagne not included. I placed down a rectangular shape made from sandstone underneath. Once it was done, I slowly filled it with water. Afterwards, I cut out a small opening in the middle of the pool so it cascaded down into the ocean. I built an identical pool on the other side under the opposite roof. The only thing missing now was a pool party. Another batch of flags came in, so I harvested and replanted the flags, fed the piggies, and finished building out the last set of sails inside of the windmill. Before I could build the automation, I had another large grind in stock. I set off to the north to get access to the pines once again. I needed a lot of resin, and I do mean a lot. I visited the old spots, but also found a couple of new ones, but it was hardly enough. It was also cold up here, real cold. I was not prepared for this weather. I forgot all about the winter gear. Here, I had the closest call of the entire playthrough. I ran face to face with a brown bear. In panic, I sprinted downhill just to run into a very large and very angry pack of wolves. Desperately, I leapt into the darkness, hoping to hit the water instead of land, and barely swam away from a wolf that jumped right after me. I counted my blessings, crafted a hay bed out of local grass, entombed myself in a box, and slept through the night to get some health back. Desperate to get enough resin, I started chopping down pines in order to trigger the resin farmer talent. Getting enough resin was no easy task. Once I ran out of pines on the main island, I had to hop islands aggressively. On top of that, I was constantly struggling to keep myself warm and probably pushing my luck a bit. But these smaller islands did not seem to contain any large threats. Once I was done, I had a long journey home. Next came the tedium of crafting 4 health hammer toggles, 4 health hammer bases, and then smithing 4 health hammer heads to create 4 health hammer arms. At least, the fat was easy to acquire. My piggies made sure of that. Once I had all the components, I climbed up to the tower and started cooking your basic 4 health hammer setup, striking a single anvil. I immediately put it to good use by smithing a bunch of copper plates, which I flipped into more lanterns. Afterwards, I placed them around for even more light coverage. The light overlay mostly showed green now, which meant drifters couldn't spawn there, although there were a few dark spots on the farming platform. Next, I had to get even more lead to craft the glass panes for the windmill's automation room. I chose a random sandstone chunk and got plenty. I also stopped by the previous copper mine and mined more copper. Once I smelted lead ingots, I made more glass panes and placed them into the windmill. I then decided to add support legs to the windmill. It didn't look particularly stable. This required replacing the connector bridge. The legs would extend all the way into the water on each side. Once the legs were done, I ran a bridge to the front of the windmill. The windmill looked a bit cooler when all was said and done. I sailed around my entire compound in a circle, admiring the look. The shit was looking dope. I was mostly happy with the overall aesthetic. Thus, I wanted to shift my priorities for now. Resonance Archives boss was on my mind, but that required better armor, which was my next goal. First things first, I used the corn to grind the borax idling in my stash. Next, I made 3 barrels of diluted borax and submerged pig hides in each one. Meanwhile, I prepared 6 barrels to make weak tannin and sealed them up to start the process. While the process was going, I sailed back to the iron spot that blessed me with iron earlier and mined a bunch of it out. At home, I fired up a bunch of bloomeries to get those iron blooms cooking. Meanwhile, weak tannin was ready, so I added more oak logs to the 3 of the barrels to create strong tannin. The other 3 barrels received the hides after borax processing was done. The armor components were coming together, but there was another big problem to solve. I needed healing. Luckily, when quarrying for sandstone, I spotted a sulfur deposit in the cave. I came back to mine a bunch of it out. Perhaps I could have done this earlier, but only now did I have linen to spare for the bandages. After grinding the sulfur, I combined with linen and honey to craft 96 of the best bandages in the game, more than enough to steamroll the archives. Next, I had a big batch of iron blooms to process into ingots and then turn those ingots into iron chains. The auto-smithing setup made quick work of this task. However, I was still waiting on the leather before I could craft the armor, so I started working on incorporating the floating platform into the overall build. Right now, it just floated in the air, and that simply was not acceptable. I expanded the dimension of the platform and extended the pig corral into the extra space. My pig population was out of control, and they deserved more room. Next, I substituted the packed dirt for premium wooden decking. It was time to transfer the leather into the strong tenon. This gave me another 4.5 days to work on my build. First, I decided to replace the packed dirt inside of the pig corral with regular soil, so it could grow grass. I wanted a lush environment for my animals. They deserved it. This was as annoying as you can imagine. I would often anger the pigs during the process, but healed right through the damage with the bandages. In the end, the corral looked so much nicer with the grass inside. Eventually, I was ready to add even more lampposts to the deck. Following, I moved a few things around. The beehive was both expanded and relocated. Next, I added the flowers back to the beehive area. Once I had things where I wanted, I decided to design a custom fence for this deck. Regular fencing would not work due to the limited space. Following, I added the custom fence to the rest of the section, relying heavily on the pantograph and the wedge tool, of course. The upper portion of the deck was looking much more put together, but underneath it was still hanging in the air. I started adding the pillars to fix that issue. When I was done with the pillars, I placed a couple more lanterns around the deck in some of the tighter places. Next, I wanted to create a cooler design for the lightning rod. I was going to support each side with a cable similar to a cell tower. The actual tower would use polished granite because it looked most similar to steel. After the initial design, I created the posts for the cables on the ground, added a few more details to the tower, made the cables appear a little thinner, and added lanterns to the top. Lastly, I wanted to add various furniture to spice up the deck even more. First was the beach chair. Once I had the design in mind, I copied it several more times by the pool area. The chair was next. I copied the chair design many times around the house. Suddenly, I remembered that the support beams on the bottom of the deck did not have the horizontal support structures. This was just a copy and paste job, but still was an important component of the look. Inside of the pig corral, I decided to plant a few maple saplings. Maples were small enough to not look out of place. I also added ferns to the grass for greater variety. Next, I had to add vines underneath the second platform as well. I wanted to add a bit more spice to the front of my house. I decided to add a thatched roof cross section to make the roof design a bit more interesting. Once I supported it with the bamboo beams, it looked something like this. And of course, I added the chimney to tie the whole look together. Meanwhile, the leather was ready and I did one last roundabout in the boat to check out all the extra additions. Once I fully absorbed the look, I started crafting. First, I crafted 4 leather bags, followed by the leather pants and a chest. Combined with the iron chain, I crafted iron chainmail for that tier 3 protection. I packed food, bandages, freshly smithed tin bronze pickaxe, and set sail to find a treasure hunter merchant. Once found, I would trade the pickaxe for the map to the archives. I was not having a ton of luck, however. I could not find a treasure hunter anywhere. I kept sailing further and further away from my base, through the icy lands in the distance. I kept finding more merchants, but alas, no treasure hunter. Eventually, as I was sailing around the sandy island, I saw something extremely odd in the distance. I sailed closer to inspect, and to my surprise, it was the entrance to the Resonance Archives, a purely random find. In my experience, archives are usually hidden in the hilly terrain, but here, they stood out from the rest of the environment. I descended into the archives and got going. I was not here to fuck around. I knew exactly what to do. First, I ran straight to the engineering. Here, I stuffed the furnace full of coal, ignited the pile, and made the ancient machine resurrect its operation. Next, I ran directly to the Bell workshop and engaged the incredibly difficult mob called the Bell. Surprisingly, this was a low drama fight. I was left to repeatedly poke him with the sword while no one bothered to stop me. The Bell's summoned drifters just straight up ditched him. I grabbed the big green gear off the table and ran back to the engineering, where I placed it inside of the machine. Following, I ran to the translocator room to use the now functioning translocator. The next section is notoriously difficult with lots of nasty monsters and locusts. However, it is nothing that a massive number of bandages can't fix. I had another problem though. There seemed to be a lot of temporal instability in the archives. Gradually, I was falling into temporal insanity. For some reason, my green gear wasn't spinning, but I was still losing stability rapidly. I decided to push through and find the machine piece I needed. Eventually, I did find it. On the way back, however, I was having full-blown hallucinations. This finally forced me all the way out of the archives to chill on the boat, waiting for my stability to recover. When it did, I went back to engineering. Here, I slotted the missing piece into a large machine and went up to the library to fight the boss. It didn't matter that my armor was not ideal for this fight. This was a pure brute force attempt, abusing the absurd number of bandages I had on me at the time. Once the library was unlocked, I beelined straight to the glider schematics. I did not feel like looting anything else in the archives. When I emerged from the archives for the second time, my stability was almost at 0 once again. I was done with the archives, but I decided against sailing back home. I wanted to see if I could find a luxury trader. I did manage to score a single resonator record in the archives, so in hopes of buying a resonator from a merchant, I searched the map for more merchants. I was in luck. A large nearby island just happened to house a luxury merchant. I crossed the water and approached the card. Not only did the merchant have a resonator in stock, but it was also relatively cheap, only 26 rusty gears. Final boss of the archives dropped me 20. I pondered about sailing back to the archives to search for gears, but instead I found a big cave on the island and decided to explore down there. This was a very large cave with a big underground network, plenty of dangers down here. For example, I found 5 locust nests spewing their annoying spiders at me. Not that I was worried with these many bandages to my name. Eventually, I found a ruin that did indeed have the gears I required. I also grabbed any trophies I could use as decorations. In the end, I ascended straight up from the cave. On the way to the merchant, I found some tool plants, which I grabbed to place in my pig enclosure. All that was left to do was to hand the merchant his gears, grab the resonator, and sail back home. Right before I made it back, another temporal storm caught me in the sea. Dave came back for the last time to congratulate me on all of my accomplishments. What a nice fella. At home, I planted the tool, scattered around various decorations from the ruins, and then made a little table for the resonator in the corner. Once the table was done, I loaded up my only record into the player and had a little pool party. Dave didn't get my invite apparently. Then, I crafted a scroll rack to store my only record. Next, I crafted the glider and took a few test flights of the windmill structure. I admired my build while swimming back from the test flights. I had a bit of time left, and not wanting to start any major projects, I tried doing something I've always neglected in Vintage Story. I wanted to craft a full set of clothes for my seraphim. I started by making a bamboo hat. Then I crafted a blacksmith apron from leather and flax. I followed it up with leather braces, which also took leather and flax. For other pieces, I would need to get into dyeing. The first dye I made was black, which was possible with 2 rusty gears. This allowed me to dye the leather to turn into a reinforced leather mask. On top of that, I needed to construct a pulverizer. To pulverize the tin ore, I had into the substance that could be mixed with water in the barrels to create linen cloth that was eventually dyeable with other colors. The colors that I used included green, made with dry grass, and red, which was produced from crushed cinnabar, which I just happened to have. There was a lot of waiting involved for the processes to transpire inside of the barrels. I skipped the time by sleeping it away. Meanwhile, the trees and the tool inside of the pig corral matured. The pigs looked a lot happier in their new environment. Once my green and red dyes were made, I crafted a nomad's mantle with the green cloth. Next, more green cloths made minstrel boots. Following, I made pastoral pants with white cloth. With the red cloth and some golden nuggets remaining from the penning operations, I made a dope red scarf. Next, more red cloths made a pair of minstrel gloves. With the remaining red cloths, I made a scarlet tunic to finish the outfit. The final drip looked something like this. With the time remaining, I just walked around my compound and contemplated existence. There was a lot to reflect upon after a dense 100-day journey. Mainly though, I hibernated all the way until the 100-day mark. On day 100, I sailed out to the sea and sat in the boat until the sunrise. After the sun came up, I did one final 360 around my build saying my goodbyes. I loved my place, but I would never see it again. Hello fellow Earthlings. If you made it this far in this video, I only have one thing to say. I love you. I had a lot of fun with this challenge, and I hope you enjoyed following me on my adventure. I picked this video because some of you voted for it. I want to continue to solicit your opinion on what's next. However, I want to be honest, these videos are getting progressively harder to make. My average script length is 1300 words, and one video takes over 130 hours, including gameplay. I want to continue to make them because I know some of you love these videos. Some of these comments are really nice and sweet. Thank you guys, seriously. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I want to make vintage story content for many years to come, but I also miss a lot of my other hobbies, and my second kid is a few months away from being born. I can't guarantee anything. So if you don't see any new videos for a while, know that there will be more eventually. I ain't going nowhere. Again, thank you for watching. I'm truly humbled every day that someone takes their valuable time to watch my stuff, and on that note, Oscillascape is beaming out.